Hello, this is Scott Bilter at Atlas Risk Advisory, and today I'm going to talk about one of the most common mistakes we see in treasury organizations, and that is having a poor balance sheet forecasting process. There's a number of reasons for this, which you can see on this slide. The common pitfalls of balance sheet forecasting really stem around the fact that there's limited accountability or any real ownership of balance sheet actuals. There's certainly quite a bit of attention on the income statement. There's a lot of ownership in terms of forecasts for revenues and expenses that go throughout the organization and are often well known up to the CFO or CEO level. Same cannot be said for the balance sheet. A lot of sharing of the balance sheet. There's a lot of reasons behind this, of course. The balance sheet and forecasting the balance sheet is very complex and not the top of anyone's to-do list, at least outside of Treasury. So because of this, you end up getting forecasts pretty frequently that is not ideal. It could be some junior analysts that may just be stuck with the task of coming up with this balance sheet forecast, and they don't know what to do beyond maybe trending the past month's balance sheet. Maybe line item by line item, maybe putting some seasonality into it, but there's not a lot that they are really able to do. And this is because it's a very decentralized process, and they don't really know how the balance sheet is going to move that month and all the things that go into that. It's actually very complex. So asking them to come up with an endpoint for that and use that endpoint as what you're going to hedge a month in advance for your balance sheet forecast is really kind of doomed to fail from the beginning. So the main problem is that they're not leveraging existing forecasts in the company that can be very helpful for coming up with a month-end balance sheet, and that is the income statement forecasts that are probably already being generated every month or maybe even a few times a month by the FP&A group perhaps. So the revenues and expenses that will eventually turn into receivables and payables on the balance sheet are really important to utilize in the company for forecasting your balance sheet. Not enough people leverage that or understand those dynamics well enough. They may be hedging those on a FAS 133 or a cash flow hedging program, but then ignoring it on the balance sheet, and this is not a good idea. There can certainly be, an efficient handoff from a de-designation from a hedge from FAS 133 to FAS 52 is one way to handle it. But even if you don't do that, you really need to make sure that these items are part of the forecast instead of just focusing on the end state of the balance sheet. You really need to understand how it flows from the income statement to the balance sheet. And because of this, the last pitfall we see is that people are spending unnecessary time trying to figure out when receivables and payables will be collected or paid, especially the receivables being collected part, which is out of their control. Hopefully some major payables they have control over. And it really is not necessary from an FX risk perspective. And to explain that, I'm going to show on the next slide a very simplified example of why, if you're going down the road of trying to figure out the timing of that, you may be trying to forecast more than necessary. Now, it can be important for other reasons in terms of forecasting cash flows of the company, but purely from an FX risk perspective, it is not important to get that right necessarily. And to show that point, this is a very simplistic example. So we're just going to talk about an entity where the exposure that we're talking about are revenues in a currency different than the functional currency. So it could be that you're dollar functional and you've got euro revenues, for example. And in this simplified example, I'm going to say that a typical amount of revenues for a month is 100. We'll assume that a typical amount of receivables is 1.5 times that, so about a 45-day collection period on average. There's other things in terms of how to build a balance sheet. You'd want to account for accruals that don't hit the balance sheet from the income statement, things such as maybe deferred revenue or some other one-off items that could be important there. For this simplified example, I'm showing accruals of 0. And then the other part that we need to understand the dynamics of are what are the cash deliveries and the settlements throughout the month. So if you have a certain day of the month that all that gets settled and is timed up with your FX maturities, that's great. So you may have a netting day process in your company, but in any case, if you have an entity that's got excess cash in a certain currency in this example, so receivables that will be collected in euro beyond the expenses, so we're kind of ignoring the expense side in this example, then you would be converting those to dollars at some point, we're assuming one day a month that may be happening here. So in this build model, we're going to assume a prior month-end balance sheet of 150. Again, this is sort of your past typical 100 of revenue, 45 days worth, so you have 150 of receivables. And that's your best guess of your month-end balance sheet. On top of that, we're going to add our forecast for the income statement for the next month. Very simple. We're going to say it's a typical month. It's going to be about 100 of revenues. And again, in this example, we're not going to have any accruals. So our initial hedge in this case, which you'd be doing in the last day of the month, would be a hedge of 250. Now that may seem like an overhedge to begin with. This isn't necessarily a hedge that's going to go over the next month end yet. This could be going to the middle of the month or to the netting day of the company as a starting point. So what happens when you get to that day and you've had some excess cash build up in that entity, you don't have to worry about whether it's been a big collections month or a small collections month if you have this methodology and you treat that collection with an even swap. So in this case, let's just say that maybe in month one, a lot of the revenues were towards the end of that month, and so it wasn't a great collections month the next day. They were still outstanding over the next 30 days, and we had a sort of a lower than average collection month, and we only have 80 to deliver and euro to convert to dollar in this case. So what you'd have is you'd have contracts, your initial 250 hedge, you deliver 80 against that and swap the remaining 170 to the next month. So now what you'd have is you'd have a hedge of 170 and your finishing balance sheet for that month in this example would be very close to that 170. Of course, it could differ if your balance sheet the month before wasn't exactly 150 and you were guessing there. If your income statement estimate of 100 is off, then you will be off by bits there, but you will not be off based on the collection and the conversion of euros to dollars. So again, the problem that a lot of folks have is the piece that's within control for Treasury is the conversion of that euro to dollars, and that is the balance sheet event. The event of turning a receivable into euro cash is not yet a balance sheet event from an FX perspective. It's still a euro asset. It's taking that euro asset and turning it into a dollar asset is what's going to change the balance sheet, and Treasury is in complete control of that. And when that happens, it's going to happen at a rate different than your accounting rate. You should not handle that with a spot trader. You're going to have a lot of noise as a result of that. So you want to handle that as a swap. So that's how you end up with 170 as your hedge ultimately at the end of the month, which should match very well with your actual exposure, and you have less noise. And that is the conclusion of the poor balance sheet forecasting methodology.